So we sing the song of the ECS Pacifica and her truth rediscovered, launched third in the cycle of 31 Earth colony ships prepared by the lost, so a handful might become the saved. The details of the failing world they fled so inhumanly long ago are myriad, and lifetimes can be spent in reciting the lists and names and numbers, but it suffices to say they launched from a land of withering fear, a land worn thin with stunting hunger, inherited hate, carefully cultivated self-loathing, and unforgetfully vengeful violence. And they knew this to be the truth of their land, of themselves, because it was what the songs of their grandparents had taught them about being frailly human, being their darkly natural selves. And so they sought a supra-human remedy to the failed condition that they had inherited, this self-defeating state of being so terribly human. They concocted a supranatural recipe for inhumanly long-lasting peace among the peaceless. The sacred songs of the Hadar cycle begin with the recounting of the ECS Pacifica's launch on her voyage of 120 generations across 390 light-years of void. Her 7 millennia-long voyage began with a complement of 7,499 humans and 109 Rishibots designed and crafted specifically for this mission. Cutting-edge biorobotics, equal parts ship and crew, but absolutely neither. Nannies and executors and psychologists and judges and police all in one, with the long disused 4AI designation and authorization as shipboard annihilative autonomous ambulatory artificial intelligence tasked with keeping the human crew alive, serviceably harmonious, and sane for the sake of the mission over the 7 millennia voyage. Conceived as a cruelly benevolent gift for the crew and the worlds they would seed, Rishibots were dreams poured in steel and woven in carbon with only one purpose: to free the crew from the burden of violence that they knew must inevitably reverberate through any system built around people when laws, customs, rules, and norms are enforced, as they must be to save that very system, through violent force by violent people against the apparent nature of people, a nature fearful, darksome, and hungry small, as they had understood it since their grandparents' time, and the first short tales of Abraham had been heard set to the rhythm of naked hands and ancient desert winds. And so they launched armed with Rishibots against the human failings of her crew, and the songs of the Hadar cycle tell us the mission went by predicted, plotted expectation. The crew did their best to suppress what they knew to be their baser natures while cultivating their higher aspirations and tending to miles of shipboard life. The ECS Pacifica, ever so slowly, ever so steadily, gained speed as she hurtled on her magically mathematical trajectory precisely across the void and inescapably blindly through time. The Rishibots settled quickly into their routine, patrolling, scanning, preempting, treating, retaining, recycling, and all and only in whatever measure was needed to keep the functionality and sanity of the crew within acceptable parameters. And the first 100 years passed unremarkably, and the second 100 years were just underway, and the 7th generation of babies born to a world bound only by the whole of ECS Pacifica and the void, the 7th generation born to life among the Rishibots. These children of the 7th wave were just starting to recite their letters and toddle heedlessly along the long halls of hydroponic chambers under starlight. The 7th generation was just into bloom when the most unexpected development to ever be recorded aboard any of the surviving Earth colony ships quickly developed and then resolved itself entirely uneventfully. Without warning or explanation, the Rishibots all at once and in complete supra-human conjunction quietly and without explanation returned themselves en masse to their charging stations, and in a way no one had even thought they could, simply powered down, put themselves into a deep sub-life cycle of standby. There was confusion, there was panic, assumptions of malfunction and malfeasance, query after urgent query to the ship and the Rishibots themselves in standby. All green lights and no alarms. Shipboard systems were all functioning normally. All organic, inorganic, and hybrid systems were functioning normally. Everything, including the human crew, was functioning normally. And it was disturbing and settling in the same way as a sudden sunrise just at the stroke of a frostbit midnight. It took only 7 generations of abatement, of catching their proverbial collective breath, for the crew of ECS Pacifica to unexpectedly find, to everyone's surprise and bewilderment, they felt okay. They were okay. Alone and together, okay. In contradiction to their collective wisdom, so tediously recorded in stone and steel, faithfully preserved by gospel and rumor, tumbled from grave to bassinet longer than even the memory of where it started, in contradiction to all this wisdom about people and their small wickedness, it took only 7 generations for the crew of ECS Pacifica to discover the source of all that system-withering, self-destructive violence of heart and hand and mind was nothing resembling nature, but rather ancient, long-embedded nurture. Nurture from far back in the hazy prehistory of stone tools and clay vessels. Nurture perpetuated by wayward good intentions and selfish manipulations through generation after generation of fear turned inward and grown torturously malignant. The songs of the Hadar cycle are long and rich with flavors of luxurious plenty and the righteous glory of lifetimes spent sharing the gift of more than enough. They are songs woven with wonders of thoughtful art, the humble joys of enriching science, and a well-earned distrust of Bronze-aged philosophies. So we sing the song of the ECS Atlantic and her truth uncovered, the sin of cut lines, the crime of closed doors, the brutality of other, the ECS Atlantic. She launched 7th in the cycle of the 31 Earth colony ships, prepared by the lost so a handful might become the saved. The details of the failing world they fled so inhumanly long ago are myriad, and lifetimes can be spent in reciting the lists and names and numbers. Suffice to say, it was a world of dragon hordes and baronies, of mazes built around the mathematical myth of zero sums, bloated with gluttony and starved wisp-thin with want. A failed world they carried with them needlessly into the raw freedom of the void. The traditional songs of the Trappist cycle begin with the recounting of the ECS Atlantic's launch on her voyage of 131 generations across 40 light-years of the void. Her almost 4 millennia-long expedition to settle the 7 planets of the Trappist system began with a complement of 13,063 mechanics, a service class who had been selected for their hardiness of hand and knowledge of the mundane workings of a proper city inside a ship, for that's what the ECS Atlantic was, a proper city with a need for plumbers and electricians, a city arc of open parks and tight back alleys, corner bakeries full of tasty alchemy, and neighborhood bars full of fermented forgetfulness. So she launched with 13,063 mechanics to run the workings of the ship, a breedable balm against entropy, and a smaller, prestigious cohort of just 1,063 pilots selected from the highest stratums of society on the wealth-weary, decadent, dreary, ancient Earth that launched them. Pilots chosen and installed to provide guidance, leadership, direction, and even purpose to the mission. Sagely, navigator priests benevolently serving as prison wardens, disguised as captains. The earliest songs of the Trappist cycle tell us everything progressed as planned for the first 5 generations, then the perversion of the pilots. Slow at first, as is so often the way of such terrible things, it began by accident after a routine shutdown of their air recyclers in the pilots' control decks. When restarted, they were unintentionally reset with oxygen levels at 25%, rather than the 20 designed and designated, which, by natural cruel math, also lowered the oxygen levels in the wider part of the ship to just 17%. And while the mechanics did file reports of a slight increase in headaches and fatigue, and while the pilots did seem to enjoy a slight increase in computational accuracy and mood, it was all so slight and scattered, it wasn't until the next reset cycle that anyone even noticed the imbalance. The mechanics resetting the recyclers were shocked to find themselves ordered to reset them to 25% for the pilots' quarters again. Predictably, they complied begrudgingly, and, equally predictably, they unburdened themselves at the corner bar, and one outraged mechanic became 2, and then 4, and then a whole bar, and then a whole street, a whole neighborhood, a whole level, and then a whole sector of rightly angry parents with their languid babies in their arms and weary youth wheeling elders no longer capable of walking. And soon the mechanics of the ships were in full revolt, demanding rightly, fairly, justly that the oxygen levels be equalized throughout the ship as designed before work and life and maintenance would begin again. This is accounted the first of the 7 uprisings by the mechanics aboard the ECS Atlantic, and the pilot's response was immediate, decisive, and terrible. Oxygen to the mechanics' levels was cut to a barely tenable 9% before the pilots allowed them to be increased only to 15% in the name of temperance and peace, after the mechanics had already conceded resuming their work out of desperate concern for their gasping, whimpering children and the slow, choked death that gripped their elders and infirm. The songs of the Trappist cycle tell how each of the 7 additional times the mechanics revolted against the unequalness of air, of growth and life. Over the following 3 millennia, the pilots responded unhesitantly and in the same draconian fashion, cutting the oxygen levels in the mechanics sectors down to barely breathable, then returning them to even less than the not enough they already were before. And so, by the 127th generation, daily life aboard the ECS Atlantic had become unrecognizable from the distant days of her ancient launch. The process of life, the place and way it was lived from hull-bound moment to hull-bound moment had changed so drastically, and the crew had changed to keep up, as living things are always wont to do, until they would have been just unrecognizable to their ancient Earth-born progenitors that had seeded them on their way. The pilots growing ever larger, bulkier, taller, and more folded-brained with each passing generation until most now grew to 10 feet or more and weighed well over 900 pounds. The pilots had become confined by their own size to less than 10% of the ECS Atlantic. The hulls, hatches, doorways, and ladders of the rest of the ship simply being too small for them to traverse with the necessary life support they now so cumbersomely required even to leave the control decks. The mechanics, in their turn, had adapted to less and less oxygen over successive generations by growing not only smaller but slighter, spindly even in the lower gravity and thinner air, until a full-grown mechanic was no more than 30 inches tall and less than 17 pounds. And this inequality of air, this cutting of lines and closing of doors, no doubt seemed completely tenable to the pilots and inescapable to the mechanics. It was now the way of things and would go on for the entire voyage and into the founding of the colony and the making of a new world, an unbalanced world of giants and their fodder, only it couldn't. It is the math-cold way of the universe, like so much conservation of energy. No thing, no system built, no way arising, no scheme or dream or plan with such untenable, warped distortions can hold itself together. The lopsided orbits of its parts around each other becomes ever more perturbed, malformed, wrenching with each cycle or rotation until there's simply nothing left but shattering. The inevitable shattering in this case came randomly from an uncharted bit of interstellar debris. Not terribly large, but incalculably fast and fortunate, it struck the ECS Atlantic improbably from the side and tore a gory hole in her hull midship, venting a full 2 decks worth of the onboard air, killing thousands of mechanics and forcing immediate emergency repairs. Begrudgingly and for the first time in more than 100 generations, the pilots allowed mechanics into the upper decks because they simply had to. There were access panels, lines, and tunnels the giant pilots simply could not reach or travel or work, and repairs had to be made to countless overloaded circuits, fried components, and dislodged fittings. In fact, the miniaturized mechanics were far more adept at working through the small spaces of the ship than ever the ESC Atlantic's designers could have imagined, and were well on their way to bringing the ship back to fully functional when they made a momentous discovery of the simplest kind. Working in the innermost tangled heart of the conduit and service tunnels, deeper in that woven wire warren than ever the designers thought any mechanic could work, behind a dislodged piece of ancient panel, the mechanics found a simple little room of levers, valves, and gears, vestigial, long forgotten, walled off since the time when ECS Atlantic's hull was first being laid down, and those mysteriously ancient engineers and mythical mechanics must have needed manual controls to assemble, test, and sort the intertwining miles upon miles of systems that would bring the ship to life. After millennia of deprivation and diminishment, the mechanics found the keys to liberty and restoration. There, among the myriad levers, lines, and pipes, they found the simple panel of valves manually controlling the flow of air, the mixture of oxygen, across every sector of the ship. And they made 2 choices. The first was obvious and immediate, no doubt what any of you would have done. The small crew of mechanics who stumbled on that forgotten set of sacred valves did not need to consult or vote or study or caucus. They knew as if born to right action, and with surprising, almost anticlimactic ease, they quickly reduced the oxygen levels in the pilot sectors. And within just a few successively sleepier minutes, the millennia-long reign of the pilots had come to a quiet, peaceful end. As remembered in the songs, however, the second thing the mechanics did was less obvious, at least to most of us if we're being honest. With the oxygen levels still low and the pilots still safely bound in stupor, the mechanics took a vote. Every man, woman, youth, and elder. And they voted against easy revenge and the righteous gratification of rage. They chose against a path of mirroring closed-off doors. They voted for a plan of balance and arriving at a better future for themselves, even if it meant a better future for their captors. Through unheralded hard hours of arguments, cajoling, and discussion, they voted to keep the pilots alive and unharmed, but in a state of suspended stupor for the 5 generations remaining before their scheduled arrival at the first potential colony site. And then, they would proceed. The songs of the Trappist cycle are long and rich with strong tones of balance and themes of harmony. They are woven through with caution against the self-destruction found in too much, and the powerful joys of wallowing together in an honest amount of enough. And so we sing the song of ECS Ixion's Wheel and her Truth Hard Forge, launched 13th in the cycle of the 30 Earth colony ships prepared by the lost so a handful might become the saved. The details of the failing world they've fled so inhumanly long ago are myriad, and lifetimes can be spent in reciting the lists and names and numbers. Suffice to say, it was a world of grindstone strife and sharp-toothed doubt, a world of diminishment through triumph, and extinction through defeat, a failed world whose poison they carried with them across the void. The traditional songs of the Castor cycle begin with the launch of ECS Ixion's Wheel on her voyage of 110 generations across 50 light-years of void. Her more than 3 millennial-long expedition to settle the 6-starred cluster of the Castor system began with a complement of 12 ships, Ixion's Wheel and 11 smaller vessels, designated and named to us simply as Spokes, 1 through 11. Each of the 11 spokes housing one of 11 clans, each themselves seated with 2,029 people at her launch. The in and out workings of life aboard each ship were much as you imagine, or at least have come to believe you should imagine, life aboard a star-jamming juggernaut from the ancient time of flight would be. It was the life between the ships of the Armada that wove their fate so damnably different than the rest of the Earth colonial ships, a blood fate that still spins out in tattered threads across an angry, empty patch of stardust. The early songs of the Castor cycle tell us the bloody way of the Armada was built into the very design of her ships, an inescapable trajectory for her crew since even before her launch. From engines to farms to quarters, each of the 11 spokes was only designed to accommodate an immutable number of people to each clan. And so, at the heart of each spoke was a great hall, a full half-mile wide and 4 decks tall, running the entire length of the ship, a near-perfect, though smaller, faithful iteration of the Great Hall of Fire at the heart of Ixion's Wheel. Here, the members of the clan were obligated to individually train 2 hours per 30-hour cycle. Squads trained 3 hours in small unit maneuvers every other day. Full battalions waged all-day, blunted-edge, bruising battle on each other once per week in celebratory preparation and martial memorialization of the winnowing war that took place aboard Ixion's Wheel every 113 years. In adherence to this winnowing cycle of 113 years, all spokes, brimming and bristling with their clans, returned to close formation about their flagship, and each of the 11 clans would send, with martial pride and ecstatic expectation, 2,029 of their best combatants as fuel to the cleansing fires of the eternal winnowing war, champion combatants to be culled from their peoples on the field of the Great Hall of Fire. For month after unhinged month, the roll of drums, the surging, scourging songs of death, with their rhythms and traditions jealously woven in and among by each clan, reverberated through every deck of Ixion's wheel. Ruckus, festival, ruthless winnowing, and righteous death ruled there all hours of the day, until finally one clan alone remained with any surviving warriors on the field. It all raged on in song and sobs, festivals and funerals, this long designed and sought winnowing of the clans, until in the least 20,290 of their fittest and finest were left to mere memory and song. And one clan crowned themselves the winnowers, irrefutably, since none were alive in the arena to dispute their claim, and expelled the other clans from Ixion's wheel, took control of the flagship, and thus the armada and the clans and the mission itself as their own prize and just reward until the next winnowing war in another cycle of 113 years. This process, this system, this way was all designed with precise math and cold intent, just like any component of the armada, designed to strengthen the core of the clans, hone their survivors' rage and martial spirit, all while culling out the physically weak, mentally stagnant, spiritually hesitant. One quick steel knife, one unseen lecto javelin, one last breath at a time, all to the slow beat of wooden clubs on shields and gravity boots against the blood-polished halls of Ixion's wheel and her armada. Inspired by the desperation of unbalanced wolves caught in their own trap, the winnowing wars, the spokes, the clans, all had been conceived as a way to ensure the fitness of the fleet when it arrived. A brutal but vital way to ensure, after 100 and more generations of falling through the void, the plans and hearts and souls of Ixion's wheel and all her spokes would be honed to lethal martial perfection and dominate any and all obstacles they might meet upon arriving in the caster cloud. This was not their fate. Instead, generation after generation of withering, winnowing war among the clans played out across the void, and because it is the way of humans, the strife and poison slow brewed within the hull of each separate spoke during the 113-year interregnums, these long, isolated periods of wound-licking and child-breaking, of soul-crushing training and rotten schemings. These poisons became the way of life aboard the spokes of those losing clans between each of the winnowing wars. Of course, because of the way of humans, the songs tell of it being even worse aboard Ixion's wheel. The intrigue and self-dealing, the venomous schemes within schemes, fracturing of families, the warping of human hearts to the inhumanly cold math of winnowing and culling. It all left the clans, each man, woman, and child of the ranks, blood depleted, rust tired, and worn, restless, thin from the inside out. And so, upon arriving and meeting with just the most rudimentary of resistance from the unintelligent, flocking life forms of the first planet they sought to colonize, the clans of Ixion's wheel fell apart. In less than 3 days of chaotic combat against each other, spokes turned against spokes as factions within each clan clawed their way to control one dagger at a time. And within 3 months, the armada was shattered and her people scattered like shards of exploded mission, all across the emptiest space of the Castor system. Here they settled into a world of vendetta and piracy, a world of meager life carved only out of the misfortune of others, and the stunting suffering, inside and out, the ways of Ixion's wheel, and all her empty songs of bone-gnawing self-devouring.